Okay, so Ed, did you get the gift that I left with your wife for you?
I did. It's right here.
Did you? Okay, so real quick, listeners, we did a live the other night and I opened my gift from Ed, but his gift had not yet arrived. So he is going to open it in front of everyone.
I do love the dog paper.
Duh.
Awesome. Yeah.
That was the fancy wrapping paper I was telling you about.
All right, here we go.
All right, here
I will
we
describe
go.
this too for the
Wait.
listening audience.
The only hints I gave him was that it was useless, but will make you laugh.
And I was like, oh, so it's you.
Yeah, basically.
All right.
All right, here we go.
It is a brown box premium paper, which feels like Costco quality. This is not dollar store wrapping paper.
No, it was not. All right.
It's a small brown box.
Yes,
With
it's the box it came in.
It's a bobblehead.
It's an Ed bobblehead.
It's a bobblehead. I have a laptop and my.
Ed.
This is amazing.
And you have your MU shirt.
I've never loved something more.
Oh,
this is so cool.
So there you are as a bobblehead.
I look way better as a bobblehead than I do in real life. Look at that hairline. Look at that full. Oh my God, these golden locks. Man.
I didn't want to say anything like, damn, that bobblehead is hot, unlike the real Ed.
But no, but the bobblehead is. Wow, well, now I feel bad. Your mug was awesome, but the blanket I got you turned out to be the size of a tea towel, I guess.
A tea towel, yeah. I still love it.
Well, thank you, my friend, and I love this too. Appreciate it.
Merry Christmas.
33, 1, 0. Main event of the evening. Wednesday and
It's Tuesday, and you're listening to Murder Unscripted.
What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Murder Unscripted, the first of 2025. So happy New Year, everyone. We are a true crime podcast which aims to immerse you in the genre like nobody else. And I hope we're doing a pretty good job. I think we are.
We hope. Yeah, I think so.
I am your host, Ed Hydock, along with my gal pal, my true crime encyclopedia, Melissa Spivey.
Hello and happy 2025, everyone. We hope everybody had a great holiday. We hope everyone had a happy new year. And Ed and I are both so excited because we are starting 2025 off with a bang.
We definitely are. And if this is your first time tuning in, first of all, welcome. But we want to explain that this month is going to be deviating a little bit from our standard format, and you'll see why in a second. So usually what happens on Murder Unscripted is that we choose a theme and we base our cases around that theme. So we'll discuss these cases in weeks 1, 2, and 4. And then in week 3, what we do is we have a special guest, someone, a major player in the case, a prosecutor, a cop, a family member, somebody really associated who lived these cases to bring you a firsthand look. And they're usually someone I had the privilege of working with while producing a TV show or true crime episode, but new people too. We're meeting all kinds of people. So this month, we're actually going to have 2 interviews and 2 cases. And today, Melissa is going to be covering the name that I've always found synonymous with murder. Like when you say the name, there's 2. There's Jack the Ripper and there's Ted Bundy. And Ted Bundy is what Melissa will be covering today, because next week we're going to be sitting down with Edna Cowell Martin, who recently wrote a book entitled Dark Tide. There it is.
Whoop, whoop.
Which way do I point?
I don't know. Right? Down, to the left, to the right.
All right, there we go. But that talks about Edna's journey growing up with her cousin, Ted Bundy. How freaking cool, right?
That is so wild. And like, this is the ultimate case of like, you can't choose your family. Like I've heard that saying before, but It's definitely going to be a good interview. The book was really, really good. So, in week 3 of this month, Ed's going to be taking over and telling us about one of the grossest people ever, and that is John Wayne Gacy.
He is disgusting.
Absolutely foul. He's so gross looking and greasy, and I hate him. But we will follow that up with an interview with Dr. Jeffrey Smalden, who is a forensic psychologist. And he not only spent hours upon hours with Gacy, like while he was actually on death row, but he's also spent time with some of the worst of humanity, including Charles Manson. Ever heard of him?
Yep.
Ted Bundy, etc. So that should be a very wild interview as well.
And I'm very excited because we talked about these guests that we have are usually people that I've met or have worked with, but these are 2 new people that we've met through doing this podcast. So I'm very excited that we're branching out to just not just people in my inner circle, but people that are incredible perspectives that we didn't have before we started this.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. But something else I'm looking forward to is telling you my story today.
Can't wait.
We are going to be talking about the infamous Ted Bundy. So, as the listeners know, every week we end our episodes with the same line: perverts don't wear signs that say they're perverts. And this basically means that, like, no one is going to show you they're evil immediately. These perverts, murderers, psychopaths, whatever, they will try to hide their true self. And you always need to be cognizant of this. And what's wild is that in the book Dark Tide by Ted Bundy's cousin Edna, her mantra eventually becomes trust, but don't be deceived, which I feel like is really similar to perverts don't wear signs that say they're perverts.
I was so taken aback when you said that. I'm like, well, no kidding. But then when I thought about what you meant by it, it's like, man, that really does apply to a lot of situations and most of the cases that we cover.
Absolutely. And like, to me, Ted Bundy is the absolute epitome of this saying. Here's this,
Hmm.
he was charming and handsome and charismatic, and he was so intelligent that his outer persona was like the perfect man. And unfortunately, that's not who he was, as we will later find out.
Right.
As for trigger warnings, I mean, this is Ted Bundy, so we have every sort of horrific act you can imagine, from abduction to murder to rape to the murder of minors to necrophilia. So this
He
is
did it
your,
all. Yep.
yeah, he really did. And this is just your blanket trigger warning for all of the above. And with that being said, let's talk about a man whose stomach-churning crimes have horrified and fascinated us for over 40 years.
Let's do it.
So Theodore Robert Cowell was born on November 24th, 1946, to 22-year-old Eleanor Louise Cowell, and she went by Louise. So that's what I'll call her. And if you notice, that's not the Bundy last name. He actually would not take on the last name Bundy until he was about 5 years old when his mom remarried, but we'll get to that in a little bit. So at this time, as this was the 1940s, society did not take kindly to young women who got pregnant out of wedlock. 16 and pregnant wasn't a thing then,
Right.
so
Wasn't
yeah,
glorified like it is today.
right. So Louise was sent to a home for unwed mothers in Burlington, Vermont, where she would ultimately give birth to Ted. That's so ridiculous. A home for unwed mothers. Like,
It sounds so archaic.
yes, and I just can't imagine that anything good ever happened there. Like, I just get a
Right.
bad feeling.
Right. You'd think
So,
it would be better off being at home and loved by family members and have help.
right. But, oh, what shame would be brought to the family if anyone knew Louise was pregnant and out of wedlock, no less.
The horror.
Oh my goodness. Well, we don't know too much about Ted's biological father. Many sources will say he was in the Air Force or maybe the Navy, but Louise would never admit who Ted's father actually was, which then meant Ted would never know his father. And Well, I'm sure his father is long dead by now. I'm dying to know if his like biological father ever realized who he spawned.
On that same note, I've always wondered if the fact that Ted didn't know his dad, if that contributed to the horrific things that he'd done. For example, if I don't know where I came from, how am I supposed to ever like find myself and know my true self? So I do see, I mean, it doesn't excuse anything, but I kind of
Right.
see some signs.
No, and his not knowing about his father would definitely like just plague him throughout his entire life.
Hmm.
Actually, for many years, there were rumors that Ted's maternal grandfather, so Louise's own father, Samuel Cowell, was Ted's father.
Oh my
But
God.
yeah, gross. This was actually definitively proven as false in 2020. So
Hmm.
his grandfather was also not his father. So that's good.
Right.
And apparently the topic of Ted's biological father was very taboo, and Louise like refused to discuss it with him, which ultimately led to Ted having feelings of anger and resentment towards his mother. And just like you kind of said, I also feel like this began some really complicated feelings of abandonment and even like inferiority. Kind of like
Yeah.
exactly what you said, like this is going to mess with him. So after Ted was born at the home in Vermont, he and Louise returned back to Louise's parents' home in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Whoop whoop.
Hmm. Nice. Go birds.
Oh my gosh. And apparently, the story that they told to outsiders was that Sam and Eleanor, that's Louise's parents, had adopted this random baby, and that's why they suddenly had baby Ted.
Weird,
So,
but
yeah.
okay.
So, for the first few years of his life, Ted was told that his grandparents were his parents and his mother was his sister.
Like, imagine that being the truth that you know, that like your reality. So I guarantee in those early years that Ted showed signs of like self-esteem issues that we talked about, self-doubt, lack of trust in others, you know?
Well, and like, I want to take a step to the side quick because there are a lot of things written about Ted, especially his early life, that I think have been embellished either by Ted himself or by journalists trying to like sensationalize and be like, oh my gosh, bad childhood. That's why he's crazy. It's totally because of that.
It's low-hanging fruit.
Exactly. And I also wonder if just some of these details are wrong because it's been so long and it's like a game of telephone. Like people keep talking about it, little things get changed.
Sure.
So, just like with the rumors about Samuel Cowell being incestuous with Louise and fathering Ted, it's very hard to decipher the truth. Fun fact, Jack Nicholson was also raised believing his mother was his sister and his grandparents were his parents.
Weird. He
I
turned out all
know.
right though, right? Minus the Shining. I mean, he was a little creepy in that, but I think he was acting.
I would hope so. So, before we get to Ted's life in Washington, I do want to mention that many sources report that Ted's grandfather, Samuel, was a cruel, abusive bigot who did things like he allegedly threw his daughter, Louise's sister, down a flight of stairs for something super innocuous. Like, I think she overslept. Then on the flip side, Ted always spoke very highly of his grandparents and seemed to really look up to his grandfather. And
Hmm.
just to present all of the information to you, in Edna's book, she briefly addresses that she had heard that he wasn't the nicest man, and she admits that she was only in his presence a couple of times, but she never witnessed anything, and I guess like no one talked about it later. So
Hmm.
I don't know. And then there's another instance in Ted's childhood that people like love to talk about and point to as something horrific. So apparently, when he was like 3 years old, Ted supposedly collected all the knives from the kitchen and put them in the bed of his Aunt Julie, which is Louise's sister, while she was like
Mhm.
still in bed. And when she
Wow.
woke up, surrounded by knives, she saw Ted just standing at the end of her bed, staring at her and smiling, which sounds absolutely terrifying because like creepy kids are the
Yeah.
friggin' worst.
They are in The Shining. There's creepy kids in The Shining.
Yeah.
It reminds me that reminds me, remember James Cushing from our the Lizzie Borden wannabe? He would just
Yes.
stand over his mom's bed. He had a knife in his hand, and
So weird.
Pacific Northwest, that was the same area. So I tell you, some crazy stories out of the
It's scary
out of
out
Washington.
there.
It is.
Well, speaking of this, I almost said the Pacific Northwest. No, the Pacific Northwest. Louise and little Teddy, as he was known, moved to Tacoma, Washington in 1950, and they would stay with Louise's uncle John, his wife, and their son John Jr. And I believe that John Jr. and Ted were about the same age. So this family, the Cowells, were the American dream. They really were. Like, John was a legitimately professional and classically trained concert pianist, and his job would ultimately take the family all over the world. Like, they lived in Paris at one point. They were just all over. And just a side note, this family would eventually grow to include Edna, who's our special guest for next week. So Ted's uncle John was Edna's father.
I'm very excited to talk to her. She's been so like, we've corresponded with her off air, obviously, but she's so sweet. I can't wait.
Yeah, she seems really sweet. I've watched a few other interviews with her. So, but Edna wouldn't come along until the following year, and that was actually after Louise and Ted had moved out. So they lived there for a year, moved out, Edna was born. And again, this family was like the perfect nuclear family. Like, they were financially well off, and they were just very worldly and cultured and successful. And Ted just wished that this was his family. In Edna's book, she talks about how Ted just absolutely idolized her father. And actually, while Ted was in college, he brought a girlfriend over to like their house, and he was like bragging about Edna's family's accomplishments. Like, he was trying to be like, yep, this is my family. I come from a good pedigree. I'm fancy. Like, very strange.
Yeah, it's weird because you wonder if that also could have played a role in his anger and his like bitterness, you know? Maybe he was jealous of the things that he couldn't have. So he took the things he could have.
100%. And as we go, you'll see so much more of this. Like, he just wanted to be successful and known. And unfortunately, he was known, but not for a great reason.
Right.
So, as I mentioned earlier, Louise and Ted would stay with John and family until the following year. This was now 1951. And Louise would meet Johnny Culpepper Bundy. They fell in love super quick. They got married, and eventually they would later go on to have 4 kids together. So Ted would be the oldest, and then he had 4 half brothers and sisters.
Okay.
And when they got married, this is when Ted would officially become Ted Bundy. Dun, dun, dun.
I don't think many people know that. I'm glad we talked about his upbringing because he was not always a Bundy. He doesn't even know who he is.
I will say Johnny, his stepfather, he really tried to build a relationship with Ted, but Ted just was not having it. And when his mother and Johnny proceeded to have the 4 children together, like, that didn't help their relationship. It stayed quite frosty. And apparently, the biggest reason that Ted didn't like Johnny was because he felt like Johnny was too lowbrow to be his stepfather. And you know what? Johnny was in the Navy, he worked as a cook, and I don't understand what's like so bad about that. But Ted was so embarrassed of it. And again, he compared his life and his situation to his cousin's life. And I feel like if Ted wants to do all these comparisons, he was so much better off than so many other kids. And while he was in school, like, he did very well academically. In middle school, he wasn't super popular or anything. By high school, he did get a little more social. But he definitely, I don't think, was the charismatic Ted that we think of in his older years. So after he graduated high school, he went straight to college at the University of Puget Sound, and he was there for about a year, and then he decided to transfer to University of Washington. And he had a few different majors, like, in these first few years of collegiate life, but I don't think that he ever really clicked with the majors he picked. which then it didn't hold his interest. And then in 1968, he dropped out of college altogether, and he just kind of decided to take like random minimum wage jobs. So let's put the academic life on hold for a minute, because during this time in Bundy's life, and this is a huge deal, he was dating a young woman who he would actually say was the only woman he ever loved. This woman's name is not hard to find, but she has been pseudonymed for so many years as Stephanie Brooks. I'm just going to keep that going.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah. So I guess Stephanie was a very classy and sophisticated young woman, and she came from a really good upper middle class family.
Well, that's exactly what he was looking for. It sounds like he knew he wanted that hoity-toity.
Yes.
Yeah.
He like loved going to her house and talking with her
Mm.
dad and family. And Ted would later compare him and Stephanie to Sears and Saks Fifth Avenue, which is kind of funny.
Considering what Sears Hardware.
Yeah, well, he's
That's what
like
I am.
Sears and Roebuck, and I'm like, Roebuck? But I forgot that's what it was at one point.
Yeah, I forget what year it was.
Yeah, so he's basically saying he's the ground beef, she's the filet mignon. But it's sad that he's so insecure.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds to me like he was just so in awe of Stephanie, not only just the kind of high society that she lived in, but deep down, that's the life that he wanted. So I think he saw not only this attractive woman who led the life he wanted, he was jealous of her actual life.
100%. Yeah, I agree with you. And it definitely does seem that Ted just absolutely worshiped the ground she walked on. And he admitted that this relationship had a lasting effect on him. And he would later say, quote, "She inspired me to look at myself and become something more," end quote.
Can you seriously name a more like wholesome and beautiful feeling than that? You know, when
No.
a person that you're head over heels for and you love most in the world believes in you, that's something that it can literally become a driving force. So to have that, and if he ends up losing it, then I get it.
Well, that's what happens. So back to 1968, which is when Ted had dropped out of college and was just working like menial jobs, nothing exciting, no room for growth. And he's doing this while Stephanie was graduating from University of Washington and was really looking forward to a bright and super successful future. And at this point, she decided to end things with Ted, basically telling him, like, you need to get your life on track, you need to grow up, and you need to grow a backbone. In later interviews, she would talk about how he was such a people pleaser and he was like incapable of standing up for himself, which is so wild to me because we all know how like obnoxiously cocky he gets
Yes.
later in life.
Well, I feel like that, and this is my opinion, but that this is the exact moment that this whole thing changes for Ted. You know, like
Mhm.
the moment he decided that he was going to hate the world.
Mhm.
And because we've all been through something like this, and it absolutely crushes you. And it takes forever to come back from, but most of us are stable enough to understand that like we can build a bridge and get over it. Yeah, it sucks, whatever, move
Yeah.
on. But Ted, on the other hand, has dealt with not knowing who his father was, to being told that his grandfather is his father. He doesn't have this posh lifestyle that everyone around him has. So now the girl that he was infatuated with basically told him he wasn't good enough. So now it's like, well, oh yeah, I'll show you, you know, I'll show you what Ted Bundy is capable of.
Definitely. And we'll get to it, but he is so petty. It's honestly kind of incredible. So Ted, of course, did not take this breakup well and pretty much decided immediately he was going to get revenge. And I want to make this super clear. This woman was well within her rights to break up with Ted. What Ted did later and who he turned into is not her fault. We all have free will, and the fact that he was such a little bitch about this breakup is such a disgusting and toxic form of fragile masculinity. He just, it's disgusting. Like, she doesn't owe him anything. And I think that in a lot of reporting, especially from the 70s, 80s, whatever, she kind of got blamed, like, oh, she broke his heart and blah, blah, blah. Like, no, it's not her fault. She's allowed to break up with someone.
Yeah, and you're talking about even in hindsight, like in retrospect, you were dating Ted Bundy. I think breaking up with him was a good move.
Right, exactly. But everybody wants to point fingers. So stick a pin in Stephanie, as she will eventually be back in Ted's orbit. So this breakup left Ted just distraught and broken. And I think at this point, he's trying to figure himself out. I think he kind of took Stephanie's words to heart about growing up, figure out what you're going to do with your life. So Ted began getting involved in politics, and we'll get back to this a little bit later, but Ted Bundy, not gone so horrifically off track, he could have been a legitimate bigwig in the world of politics.
Totally. He had the looks, he had the charisma, like people liked him, and he would have made a good senator.
100%, or governor. Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely. The following year, so we're now in 1969, I think this is when Ted went on a literal journey to find himself. He left the Pacific Northwest and he traveled across the country, and the goddess of true crime, Anne Rule, she speculates that he may have gone back east to try and gain information on his biological father. At some point, though, he would find himself back in Philadelphia, and he tried a semester at Temple University, but that did not hold his attention, and soon enough, he was back in the Pacific Northwest. And it's around this time in 1969 that Ted would meet Elizabeth Kendall and her baby daughter, Molly. Again, Liz's last name is a pseudonym, and we're just going to leave it at that. So Ted's relationship with Liz would last until 1975. So he was already killing while he was with Liz.
Hmm.
And I think Liz is the girlfriend that most people associate with Ted. So Ted decides to go back to University of Washington, and this time he decides to major in psychology.
Oh, what a calculated move that is, you know? If you can better understand the human mind, you can better manipulate the human mind. So,
100%. And
there was an
that's what he was.
agenda.
Yes, he wasn't doing
Mhm.
it to help people.
Right.
So Ted would go on to graduate in 1972, and at this point he decides he wants to go to law school, and he's adamant about going to a well-known and very prestigious law school because of course he does.
I never knew he was so envious, so uppity, I guess. And I knew he was cocky, but I didn't think it had anything to do with his social status. I thought it was more just about a power trip.
No, he was obsessed with how he looked and who he knew, and just wanted to be someone, I guess, and just wanted to come across as cultured and worldly and sophisticated. This was so big to him. So,
Hmm.
and he wants to at least portray himself like that. But when he takes his exams to get into law school, I think it's the LSATs, he didn't
Mhm.
do so hot. And this was Trey embarrassing. And in Ted's mind, this meant he was an epic failure.
Mm.
So Ted ended up attending the University of Puget Sound again, but this time the School of Law, and he was taking some night classes. He would later get accepted to the law program at University of Utah. And again, this whole time, Ted is in a serious, committed relationship with Liz. He's helping her raise her daughter. He was living this perfect little American dream. But of course, that was not enough for Ted. So even after these couple of years, Ted had not forgotten about his revenge plot on Stephanie. He was playing the long game here.
Mm.
So sometime around 1972, 73, Ted started seeing Stephanie again. And he basically presented himself to Stephanie as the new, improved, mature Ted Bundy. And Stephanie was digging it. She was really happy, and she quickly fell back in love with Ted. And this is so sick But once he knew that she was like head over heels in love with him again, he essentially ghosted her, just like straight up bailed on her.
And so that was his plan, was to, like, hurt her because she hurt him?
Yep, that was his plan. Like, that's some
Got her.
extreme
Yeah,
pettiness. Like,
I'll say.
Petty LaBelle over here. So petty.
Eddie LaBelle. And you yell at me for dad jokes. Wow.
Petty LaBelle.
Well, and sorry to interrupt, but the way you described Stephanie, like, she sounds a lot like his future victims. You know, thin, good looking, long, straight, dark hair parted in the middle. So it makes me wonder if he had this, like, if he had Stephanie in mind every time he went after somebody.
Alright, so I was waiting for, like, you to bring this up. So, you're right, many of his victims did fit that profile. However, not all of them did, and in that Psychology Today article I mentioned earlier, they kind of tried to debunk this, and one of the points that they made was this is the '70s. The whole straight, super straight, pin straight, long, dark hair thing was, like, the popular style at the time.
Yeah, everybody looked like that.
Yeah, so I feel like that's another thing that maybe journalists, society, whatever, tries to make a bigger deal of. I don't know that for
Hmm,
sure, that's just kinda how I feel about it. But whether or not these victims were carefully selected by Ted in some weird attempt to, like, kill them in place of Stephanie, I don't know, but
hmm,
that is, like, a popular subject when it comes to Bundy, so I'm glad we, went over it.
hmm, yeah.
So now we're up to 1974, and this is a very busy year for Ted, but not for anything good. So in 1974, he would pretty much murder at least one woman a month, sometimes multiple.
It was like clockwork.
Yes, it was wild. Like there was very little cooling off period.
He was in a frenzy.
Yes. And towards the end, I think he was just completely losing it. So the official count of his victims, I believe, is 36, but there's speculation that the number is much higher. And sadly, many of his victims, like to this day, have never been found, which is just so heartbreaking for the family. And actually, in the 2 to 3 days prior to Ted's execution, spoiler alert, he started confessing to many of the murders that I'm about to tell you.
It's funny, he and other killers like him, Gary Ridgway, John Wayne Gacy, they in the true crime world, these guys come up as red herrings for us. When we are doing a let's say we're doing a story in the Pacific Northwest that took place in the mid 70s.
Mhm.
Ted Bundy is used as a red herring because he was operating in that territory in that time. So he's an open-ended suspect that you can
Yes.
use in any story because there's so many victims that could be tied to him.
Well, and don't quote me on this. I don't have anything in my notes about it, but I'm pretty sure that even when they started finding some of Gary Ridgway's victims, their first thought was, "Oh, this is a Bundy
Was this
victim."
Bundy? Yeah, because they
Yeah,
overlapped for a short time. Mhm.
right. So, Bundy's first confirmed victim, she miraculously survived his brutal attack on her. So it's January 4th, 1974, and Ted sneaks into the bedroom of Karen Sparks, and she was attending the University of Washington, where she was studying political science. And at the time, Karen was living with three male roommates, so, like, of course, she felt safe. So she's asleep one night. Ted creeps into her room, and somehow he's able to break off a piece of her bed frame. So I'm not quite sure what this weapon ended up looking like, but I'm imagining like a metal rod. So, using this makeshift weapon, Ted beat Karen in the head, like ruthlessly, which actually ended up leaving her with permanent brain damage. And
Hmm.
he also used this weapon to rape Karen so brutally that her bladder was split in half.
Wow.
And there was a lot of damage to her internal organs. after all that, Ted ultimately left. I saw in an article actually that he might have heard one of Karen's roommates like talking in his sleep and got super spooked and then fled.
Oh, and took off.
Yeah. Unfortunately for Karen, her roommates didn't realize that something was wrong for more than like 16 or 17 hours. Like it was the following night.
Yeah.
Karen, when they found her, she went to the hospital. She was actually in a coma for 10 days. But this incredible woman somehow survived. And I don't know if this is fortunate or unfortunate, but she had no memory of what happened.
I would think fortunate, but that's
Yeah,
me.
I think you're right.
The haphazardness of this attack was always interesting to me because we've talked so many times about unorganized killers
Mhm.
and how they make mistakes. They leave fingerprints. They get seen by eyewitnesses. They don't have a plan, and maybe it's because this was his first time. I don't know if he
Right.
was maybe taking like murder for a test drive. So because it definitely doesn't sound like Ted Bundy when you think of this attack and the others. This doesn't sound like him.
No, you're absolutely right. It's chaotic, it's messy,
Hmm. Hmm.
it's almost like the crimes he begins to commit at the end when he's
Yes,
just kind of losing it.
off the rails. Yeah.
Yes. So on February 1st, same year, 1974, so this is less than a month after the attack on Karen, Ted Bundy abducts and murders 21-year-old Linda Ann Healy. And Linda was kind. She was this beautiful one. All of his victims are stunning. And she was a senior at University of Washington where she was studying psychology. So Linda was known for her beautiful singing voice, and she was also known, this is so cool, as the local like weather girl for the local radio station. She
Hmm.
would give the skiing weather report each morning. So people
Hmm.
knew her because they all loved to ski out there. Ted was a big skier, actually.
Hmm.
At some point during the night, Ted breaks into Linda Ann's home, and she shared this home with 4 other young women who would later say that they didn't hear anything. No screams, no noises, just nothing. Just so
Hmm.
crazy.
Yeah.
So when her roommates discovered that she wasn't in her room and they discovered that she had never gotten to work, which was unlike her, and they realized she's missing, they immediately called police and her family. Linda's remains would not be found until the following year on Taylor Mountain. So this means he abducted her out of her bed and like took her, I guess, out the window. Like, and no one heard anything.
It's crazy. Crazy to
Yeah.
me.
Well, he ended up, like I said, he left her on Taylor Mountain, and Taylor Mountain is definitely a big dumping ground of Ted's. Investigators would eventually find the remains or partial remains of several young women.
It's fascinating that he wasn't choosing people who lived alone. It tells me that he either didn't know what he was walking into or he was so cocky that he thought, I can walk into anywhere I want and do whatever I want.
Yeah, I don't know how he picked people. Like some people was because they were there and it was convenient.
Mhm.
But these first couple murders, I have no idea how he decided on those women.
Hmm.
So on March 12th, 1974, 19-year-old Donna Manson disappeared. Donna was a student at Evergreen State University, which is in Olympia, Washington. And I think she was working towards her bachelor's degree in English. And she was a super smart young woman. And this is so cool, but she was like an expert flutist. Is that how you say it? She played the flute and she was an expert at
Fl-
it.
Flautist? I think it's
Flautist?
flautist.
Is that what it is?
Flautist. I think so.
Well, she was an expert
She
at
played
playing
the
the
flute.
flute. Yes. At the time of her death, Donna was going through some mental health struggles. She did seem ready to try and make steps towards like pulling herself out of this depression. So on the night of March 12th, Donna told her roommate she was going to go to a jazz concert on campus, and she left their shared home and went in the direction of where the concert was being held. It was about a week later that she was reported missing. she had taken off for a weekend here or there, so nobody was like immediately concerned. But her body was never found or never identified.
Didn't Ted once say that during his death row confessions that he admitted to Donna's abduction and murder, and that police had already like found her though?
Yeah, he said something about he did, but officially as of this recording, she's still considered missing.
Hmm.
He would say that about a couple of his victims, like, "Oh, well, you already found the shin bone." So,
Yeah.
oh no,
Hmm.
again, it's so hard to know what he's telling the truth about and what he's not.
Yeah.
So, our next victim is 18-year-old Susan Rancourt. And Susan, again, another super intelligent young woman. She was majoring in biology at Central Washington University, and she was like part of the pre-med program. So she had big plans for her future. And according to multiple sources, she was really smart and really sensible. So on the night of April 17th, 1974, Susan was going to some sort of job interview on campus for what I think was like an RA position, like a residential advisor in the dorms.
Hmm.
I think they called it a dorm counselor.
Yeah.
So after this interview or meeting, meet and greet, she was going to a friend's house to watch a movie. She made it to the interview meeting, but after that, she was never seen alive again. Her
Hmm.
skull would be found the following year, again on Taylor Mountain. And Susan's rape and murder was one of Ted's like last minute confessions right before he was put to
Hmm.
death. So around the time that Susan disappeared, and again that was in April, police were beginning to receive reports from other Central Washington University female students. And the reports told of a man with a cast who either like a cast on his leg with crutches, or maybe he had his arm in a sling. And he would come up to the woman, he would introduce himself as Ted, and he would ask for help. Like, can you help me to my car? Because, with my arm sling, it's so hard, blah, blah,
Hmm.
blah. So it's speculated that this was like the beginning of one of his most infamous ploys to abduct young women. Like this was almost like practice with the cast and everything. And again, for anyone who doesn't know, Ted would make a fake cast for his leg. He would have his arm in a sling and he would be on crutches, the whole 9 yards, and he would ask an attractive young woman to help him with his books or something similar. And because he's so damn charming and attractive, and because these women were kind, empathetic humans, they would help him. And as he got them to his car, the infamous, I know I keep using that word, but like, I don't know what else to say.
That's what it is. Yeah.
Yeah, this car was the infamous beige VW Bug.
The Beetle.
And
Yep.
yep. So once he got the woman to his car, he would usually knock them unconscious with some sort of weapon.
Okay, for somebody who claims to be so smart, like, why is he giving people his real name?
Right?
You
What
know,
an asshat. Like,
come on, dude. So, also for anyone who has seen Silence of the Lambs, this is exactly how Buffalo Bill lured his victim into that van. He was
mm-hmm.
late at night. It was behind an apartment complex, and he's sitting there. He's got a cast on his arm, and he's fumbling with a sofa, trying to get it in the back of his cab. And she helps him. He comes over. Can you please help me? And she comes over, and he stuffs her in the van. She like pins her, stuffs the sofa in there,
Yep.
and abducts her. And
Yep.
that was absolutely inspired by Ted Bundy.
Yes, it was. So our next victim was in Oregon, and supposedly the reason for this change in venue, like from Washington to Oregon, is because Ted was trying to confuse authorities. Because, like I said, by this point, people are starting to put these pieces together, and they're hearing reports, and they're putting it together. These beautiful young co-eds are just disappearing one by one. In May of 74, 20-year-old Roberta Kathy Parks, who went by Kathy, she was really going through it. She was a student at Oregon State University, and she was struggling with her mental health, struggling with her classes. struggling with being homesick. She was from California, and I just think she was incredibly overwhelmed. And shortly before she was, spoiler alert, abducted and murdered by Ted, she had had an argument with her dad. And then her sister called her not long after and was like, Dad had a heart attack. So she's already got all
Wow.
this other stuff on her plate. And then that happened. So she's down, she's vulnerable. And Ted just is so good at like zoning in on that.
Hmm.
On May 6, 1974, Kathy's out that night. She's getting dinner at the cafeteria. It's late, like it's 11 p.m. or so. So she leaves and she bumps into a friend of hers. So that's kind of how we know the time frame. But after she speaks to this friend, she was never seen alive again. Bundy would later admit that he raped, murdered, and disposed of Kathy's body on Taylor Mountain.
See, but Bundy would not have known, unless he really took the time to get to know her, he wouldn't have known all the things that were going on in her life,
No.
everything she was going through. So, which proves to me that he was opportunistic, that he was meeting a need, and any empathy that he showed toward his victims was just a means to the end.
No, you're right. And I feel like he's very good at adapting to the situation at hand. So I feel like he could zone in on these people who are struggling and come across as a caring, empathetic human. So on June 1st, 1974, 22-year-old Brenda Carroll Ball would disappear from a bar in Burlington, Washington. Her skull would be found 10 months later on Taylor Mountain. Brenda had just dropped out of college, and I think she was a little bit lost in regard to what direction she wanted her life to go in. So while she had an apartment with roommates, she was known to take off now and then. And because of this, she wasn't reported missing for over 2 weeks.
Wow, that's a big that's hard then for police. That's
That's
quite a head start.
such a head start. And it would eventually be discovered by investigators that a bartender at that tavern where she was last seen remembered seeing Brenda talking to a man in an arm sling. Yeah. So we're going to pause with the victims for a minute, and I want to take a minute to talk about what Ted is doing in 1974 other than viciously murdering innocent women and girls. So he's still with Liz, although at this point, I think the cracks in their relationship were becoming like Grand Canyons. So this part is so, it always amazes me, but he was working at the Washington State Department of Emergency Services. And this is where he would not only work the suicide hotline, but he would also assist with like searching for these missing women. Apparently, this is in Edna's book. At one point, he put together a whole pamphlet on like how women can be safe at night.
This is the element of Ted Bundy as a whole that has always kind of fascinated me, and maybe fascinated. It's like the sickest element when people are calling the suicide hotline, or someone has a missing loved one. They are at their absolute lowest. They're desperate. They're looking for any help they can get, and when that help comes from someone who he's evil to his core, and has like an alternative agenda, like hiding who he really is, that's just sick. You're preying on people's vulnerability, which is how he made a living as a serial killer.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think the suicide hotline thing is so odd to me. And Anne Rule, who, if anyone doesn't know, he met Anne Rule actually working the suicide hotline. She would go on to write a very famous book called The Stranger Beside Me, which was all about Ted. And then she would go on to write a
bajillion more books.
A bajillion more books. And she's the light of my life. So she's like the goddess of true crime.
She's the best. Yeah,
she really is. But she has a very famous quote, I guess, where she says something about Ted Bundy took lives, but he also saved them with the suicide hotline.
It's crazy.
It's so odd. So, like I said, during this job is when he would meet Anne Rule, and he would also meet his future wife, Carol Ann Boone. And we will talk about her nasty ass later. So put her to the side for a minute. with her big ass glasses.
Jeez.
So 10 days after Ted abducted Brenda Ball, on June 11th, 1974, 18-year-old Georgianne Hawkins would disappear. She was last seen near her sorority house at the University of Washington, where she was a student. Georgianne was super well liked, she was a gifted athlete, and she was even named the Daffodil Princess at the annual Washington Daffodil Festival.
And la-di-da.
That's like my favorite thing ever. I love it. So Ted would later admit that the night that he saw Georgianne, and he was on crutches faking yet another ailment, and when he got near her, he dropped something, I think his briefcase, on the ground, and basically was like, "Oh, silly me, I'm so clumsy. Could you help me with my briefcase and help me get back to my car, cuz I'm so disabled with my crutches. I'm so sad and pathetic." And again, Georgianne was a good human and helped him, and she was never seen again. And actually, to this day, her remains have never been found, which is so sad.
She's out there. She'll turn up eventually. And I think a lot of these people will up on the mountain.
I hope so. I mean, especially with DNA.
Yeah, maybe 100 years from now, but they will.
Right. I hope. So, Ted's next attack, in my opinion, is like one of his most deranged. On July 14th, 1974, it was a super duper hot day in Washington, and Ted decided to spend the day at Lake Sammamish for, some fun in the sun. Unfortunately, though, his air quotes fun was most decidedly not fun for anyone else. So that day, there were thousands of people at this lake. Like, I think I heard something like it was 50,000 or more people, and like there
Wow.
were just all these company picnics and just all this stuff going on. So it was very crowded. But sadly, Ted would be able to abduct two young women that day.
That's different for him too. That's a little more urgent. I don't know, and I don't know why it happened.
I think a lot of this is like he just wanted to see if he could.
That's what a
No.
lot of this is, I think, with it, because breaking into people's houses that have all these roommates and things that are
Mhm.
happening just in broad daylight. Like it's wild.
He's just so like ballsy, but I don't
Mhm.
want to give him that credit.
Right.
So we're at the lake, and 23-year-old Janice Ott, she was recently married. She worked as a probation caseworker, and this girl is just lying on a towel, minding her own damn business, getting a tan. And then here comes this super handsome guy with a charming smile, and he's so polite.
I was not at the beach that day, so before you go on.
Oh, I said super handsome. You must have
Oh,
misunderstood.
I thought I heard you loud and clear, but
No. So he goes over to Janice and, his arm's in the sling, so he needs help. And he pulls the old, "Hey there, can you help me move my boat?" And again, being a good human, she said sure. And he was able to lure and somehow incapacitate Janice. And he would then take her back to his favorite spot on Taylor Mountain. And he must have tied her up, because then he goes back to the lake. He pulls the same shit and he lures and incapacitates a 19-year-old Denise Naslin. And he took her back to the mountain where he was keeping Janice.
Hmm.
So Denise was a computer programming student, and she was at the lake that day with like her boyfriend and her family and even her dog. And she just left her group for a minute to go to the bathroom. And that was the last time she was seen alive. So Ted now has these two women together, and it is speculated that he raped both women and then killed one while the other watched. So by now, Washington was absolutely abuzz with what were being called the Ted murders. Because, several people had heard him at the lake introduce himself as Ted.
How arrogant, right? To go around killing people at the pace in which he's doing it, but to use your real name. Like it's the ultimate catch me if you can.
Yeah, no, you're right. And I don't know why he did that. Like, that's so stupid. And Ted was looked into, they talked to him, but it's all just a big misunderstanding. Of course, I didn't hurt anyone. The cops are just being thorough by talking to him. It's no problem at all. No
Yeah.
worries. But internally, Ted could definitely feel the heat. And this is when he decided to relocate to Utah and enroll at the University of Utah School of Law. And in a surprise to no one, young women started disappearing. On October 2nd, 1974, 16-year-old Nancy Wilcox would disappear. She left her house to go buy a pack of gum. And her mom would later say that when Nancy left the house, she was just overcome with like an uneasy feeling. When police began investigating Nancy's disappearance, witnesses would say that they had seen Nancy with a man in a VW Bug, similar to the one that we know Ted drove. I will say that as they get these reports, and this would happen several times, people would be like, oh, it was a yellow bug, or somebody said it was a metallic brown bug. It was that color. And I would say it's a beige bug, but
I think beige is an accurate color.
yeah, flesh colored. I don't know.
Yeah, it's weird.
But so, that didn't help when eyewitnesses are saying different colors, whatever. But Nancy was never seen again. And unfortunately, her remains were never found. So later that same month, on October 18th, 17-year-old Melissa Smith disappeared. Melissa was a senior in high school, and she was the daughter of the local chief of police.
God, talk about brazen.
Isn't that crazy? Her body would be found a little over a week later. She had been raped and sodomized, and then Ted had strangled this poor child.
He's the literal boogeyman, an actual monster.
A real life monster. But again, the scariest part is that he doesn't look like a monster.
He looks like a model.
Oh, yeah, but it's just so scary. And again, perverts don't wear signs that say they're Ted Bundy.
It'd be weird.
Yeah, right. Clearly, the change of scenery in Utah did not quell Bundy's, air quotes, sickness, as he would later call it. I have a lot of words for it. I don't know that that's one of them.
Mm-hmm.
But on Halloween night, so again, that's 3 murders in 1 month. October 2nd, October 18th, and then Halloween, October 31st. He managed to abduct, rape, and murder another 17-year-old. This was Laura Ann Aim. Laura had been at a Halloween party, and when she left to get home, which we aren't quite sure where home was, I saw some reports saying that she kind of had been couch surfing with different friends, but she decided to hitchhike, and that was the last sighting of her. Her badly beaten body was found on Thanksgiving Day by some hikers.
Wow.
All right, this next part is sick. Big trigger warning, necrophilia. Ted would eventually admit that he performed his, quote, rituals with the bodies of Melissa and Laura. This would consist of washing their hair and putting makeup on them. Unfortunately, he would have sex with their dead bodies. Like, this man is a deranged maniac.
I can't even really imagine the exact reason he did this, but I'm wondering if remember we talked about him being interested in these high class women and status symbols. So I'm wondering if just cleaning them up and making them look maybe better than they really did look, maybe that was his way of, it's sick regardless, but who knows? But I also feel like all of this was super time consuming. Like he clearly wasn't worried about being caught at any of these crime scenes. And he also was probably missing a ton of class time. So his attendance, I guarantee, suffered. And I assume his grades suffered.
Oh, definitely. And he ends up dropping out of law school. And a lot of that is because, of this. Like, he just had other things to do. So up until now, Ted had been pretty lucky in that None of his victims had really seen him to, like, identify him, like, bystanders had seen him, but again, eyewitness testimony is not great when they're trying to say what someone looked like.
Hmm.
Well, on November 8th, 1974, we would finally have someone who would eventually ID Ted Bundy. Bundy would see 18-year-old Carol DeRoche at the shopping mall, and he decided that she would be his next victim. So, Carol's at the shopping mall. She goes into the mall, she goes into some store, and Ted's just kind of creeping in the parking lot, and he's keeping an eye on her car, and he wrote down her license plate. So, when Carol's done shopping, she comes out to the car, and suddenly a police officer with an actual police badge comes up to her and tells her that someone attempted to break into her car. Well,
Hmm.
spoiler alert, this was not a cop, this was Ted. I
Hmm.
don't know where he got the police badge, but he also did introduce himself as officer. I forget the last name he used,
Officer
but
Ted Bundy.
no, he didn't do that, but surprisingly.
Yeah.
So Ted's talking to Carol and he's like, yeah, someone tried to break into your car. You know, you're going to have to fill out some forms down at the station. Do you want me to just take you? Like, that would probably be easier. And she's very hesitant, but again, he had a badge. He seemed legit.
Well, yeah. I mean, we're taught to respect authority, and she's so young. She's 18. So, I mean, I can totally see why she went with him.
I absolutely can too. So she goes with Ted, and again, she's not feeling great about it. And soon she really begins feeling like this is a bad situation. And she starts getting upset. So Ted pulls over and he tries to handcuff her, but his stupid ass was so frazzled because this was not part of the plan. He ended up locking the handcuffs on the same wrist.
Oops.
Yeah. And Carol is a badass babe because she managed to fight him and she got away. She ended up like
Nice.
flagging down an elderly couple and they drove her to
Yeah.
the nearest police
Wow.
station. So Ted is super flustered, but sadly, he's not deterred from abducting someone else. So he begins just driving around and he ends up at a high school that was several miles away. And it just so happened that there was an event at the school that night, and I think it was a school play, and it was ending right around the time that he got there. Witnesses would say that they saw a man trying to talk to people, and he was just acting kind of weird. And he's still trying the police thing. And again, I'm sure he's just frazzled as hell from Carol beating his dumb ass and getting away.
Yeah.
Sadly, though, he was able to abduct 17-year-old Deborah Jean Kent. Her body has never been found, although in Ted's death row confessions, he said that he buried her in like a shallow grave.
It's like he was some kind of bloodthirsty animal on the hunt. Like I feel like most killers would have been so rattled by having that girl escape that they would go dormant for a while, or at the very least go home, and lay low for a bit. But he like gets right back at it. That's terrifying.
Isn't that crazy? And I guess he drove elsewhere just to kind of throw police off. And you can tell he's flustered and he's starting to make mistakes because police later found the handcuff keys, the handcuffs that he put on Carol. They found the keys in the parking lot of the high school.
Oh, that's so sloppy for
It's
him.
so sloppy. So, like, they could link that back. So now we're in January of 1975, and over the next 7 months or so, he would go on to abduct, murder, and I'm sure sexually assault at least five more young women in either Utah or Colorado. So the confirmed victims are 23-year-old Karen Eileen Campbell. She was on vacation in Aspen with her fiance and his two kids, having a great time. And they're at their hotel. I think they're eating dinner. And Karen went to get something from her room that she forgot. And she was never seen alive again. Like, she just vanished. And her fiance said at some point, he was like, I just had to leave without her. I came on this vacation with her, and then
Yeah,
my kids and I had to leave without her. Like, that has to be the worst feeling.
it's awful.
Yeah. So Karen's remains were later found in Colorado. Another victim is 26-year-old Julie Cunningham. She was a ski instructor, which again, that's probably how, Ted saw her because he loved skiing. So she's a ski instructor, and she had just had her heart broken, and she was going to meet her roommate for a drink, but she never arrived, and her body was never found. Our next victim is 24-year-old Denise Lynn Oliverson, and she had left her home after an argument with her fiance. I think she went for a walk to kind of cool off. And at some point, she crossed paths with Bundy, and her body has never been found, which is so sad to know that, like, her last moments, like, she and her fiance had a fight, and he
Yeah.
has to live with that for the rest of his life.
When a loved one dies, even of natural causes, I should have been there. I should have called them Thursday when I said I would. So I can imagine that that's not how he wanted to leave that.
No, that's just so heartbreaking. So, our next victim is 15-year-old Susan Curtis. She was attending some sort of conference at Brigham and Young University. She left this conference and she went to return to, like, her dorm. She disappeared, and her remains have never been found. And it's getting crazy because he's, like, getting younger. Like, she was 15, and then
Yeah.
our next one, which is especially horrific, was 12-year-old Lynette Dawn Culver. 12. Like, what are you, in 7th grade?
He can get adult women. So why kids are like extra vulnerable? It's like really easy targets, I
Yeah,
guess.
I just don't understand, and it just doesn't make any sense according to kinda how he started, but
Mhm.
Lynette was at school, and she was at school because she's a 12-year-old. So, she's at school, and she left for her lunch break. And again, she was never seen again, and her remains have never been found. And I just want to note that there are a few more victims who are potentially tied to Bundy. I mean, honestly, there are probably hundreds or way more than we know about. And if you go searching for his victims, different sources will sometimes have different names. So I kind of brought you the people that were reported on the most.
Mhm.
So finally, on August 16th, 1975, Ted was arrested in Utah.
Wasn't he speeding or something? I feel like it was a traffic violation.
Yeah, it was something really innocuous. Like, I think this is when he was kind of just lurking around the neighborhood, and I think he, like, blew a stop sign or something, and a cop went to pull him over.
And,
And this is basically when police found Ted's murder kit and his VW, and we're talking a face mask, these big trash bags, an ice pick, ropes, a crowbar, gloves, handcuffs, etc. The
hmm,
list goes on. There's a very famous picture of this kind of murder kit. We'll hopefully be able to throw it up on the screen. And in addition to the murder kit, the cop notices the missing passenger seat and the passenger door with no handle.
yeah, that
Apparently, driving erratically and having a murder kit in your car is not enough to hold someone. Don't know
that's
why.
weird. Okay,
Yeah.
carry on.
And Ted was released the very next day. So he would be arrested a few days later as police had discovered some evidence that kind of connected Ted to some of the victims in Utah and Colorado. But
Mhm.
again, they just didn't have enough to hold him.
Hmm,
So this is when he sells his beloved VW murder bug because he's like,
hmm.
shit, they're on to me.
Yeah.
Got to get this out of here. So authorities would bring Ted in again to talk to him in early October. And this time, they had 3 witnesses who could ID Ted in a lineup, including
Hmm.
the baddest babe of them all, Carol Durant. So finally, Ted Bundy was arrested and charged with aggravated kidnapping and attempted criminal assault of Carol.
Nice.
He stayed in jail until his trial the following year, which was February of 76. He chose not to have a jury trial, and he ended up only being declared guilty of the aggravated kidnapping, and he was sentenced to like 1 to 15 years in state prison, which is a
Wow.
very big discrepancy in years. Like
Yeah.
1 year,
10
15 years.
days, 10
Yeah.
days, or 15 years.
Yeah. I'm like, how do they come to that decision? And this is now when more and more charges are coming up against him, including a charge for the murder of Karen Campbell. And he pled guilty. And this is when our law school dropout decided he was smart enough to represent himself.
You know what? All these idiots though that do this, not all of them went to law school. So I'm actually surprised that Ted wasn't a better lawyer.
So now, because Ted was acting as part of his defense team, he was allowed special privileges. And this included being able to use the law library in the Pitkin County jailhouse. So the one day is like, oh, I need to go study some things for my case. So he's allowed to go upstairs to the library. And this is in early June of 1977. And this man jumped out the second story window of the library and just escaped in the Colorado wilderness. He would steal food from cabins. Like, he was caught only 6 days later. And that's just say, despite his love of like hiking in the mountains, Ted was not the outdoorsy kind of man. Like, he, especially for living off the grid in the wilderness of Colorado, he was looking rough.
Yeah, I feel like he'd be a glamper, not so much a camper.
Oh, 110%. He'd be like, yeah, we'll camp in a tent inside the Four Seasons. Like,
Yeah, in the
yeah.
Marriott. Yeah.
Uh-huh. So he was quickly apprehended and he's thrown back in jail. And of course, more charges, including escape, are added to this ever growing list. So
Hmm.
Ted's not done with these daring escapes, though, because on December 30th of that same year, 1977, this is right around like New Year's Eve, Ted would literally escape from his jail cell.
Oh wow.
And he knew that this time of year, many of the guards had taken off for the holiday and the jail would be kind of short staffed. And this determined mother effer had basically starved himself to where he lost 30 pounds so his skinny ass could shimmy through the small hole he had made in the ceiling of his cell.
Wow.
So, I mean, that's dedication to drop 30 pounds for this. But then he wormed his way through the prison like air ducts and he ends up in the apartment of the jailer. And this guy's not home because, again, we're right around New Year's Eve. It's the holidays. Like, he's out doing something.
Yeah.
So Ted steals some of his clothes and he just walks right out of jail. Bye.
It's crazy. It's absolutely bonkers because it first of all, it proves how savvy he was. He was always thinking,
Mhm.
you know, but again,
Oh,
he ended
yeah.
up in that jailer's apartment with no idea about whether or not the jailer would be home or not. So he's messy. Like I always thought Ted Bundy was so organized and put together, but he's sloppy as all hell and risky and just kind of rolls the dice on every situation.
I was just going to say, I don't know if he knew the layout of the jail to get to the jailer's apartment. Like, I don't
Mhm.
know.
Regardless, he's calculating a plan, and it reminds me of those girls on campus where he would just break in, roommates or not, and do what he was gonna
Mhm.
do. He was so cunning.
So cunning. He's like always 10 steps ahead, I feel like.
Yeah.
So he escapes and he proceeds to take like planes, trains, automobiles, whatever he could find across the country to Florida. And not really planes, but he did take a bus to a random city and then like a train to another city and then steal a car, etc., etc. And he finally ends up in Tallahassee, Florida. Now, this next crime is one of the things I think Bundy is most known for, and that's the Chi Omega sorority murders at Florida State University. So at 3 a.m. on January 15th, 1978, Ted Bundy grabbed a log off the ground and he enters the sorority house, and pretty much immediately he kills Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman. And these women were just asleep in their beds, like where they should have been safe from this monster.
That's what's so insane about all of this is that none of these women were looking for trouble. They weren't doing anything wrong. They were all just going about their business.
Mm-hmm. And the damage he inflicted. So 20-year-old Lisa Levy, she was horrifically beaten. One of her nipples was almost bitten completely off of her body. She had a very deep bite mark on her, I believe it was her left buttock. And Bundy had even broken her collarbone, which is not an easy bone to break. That doesn't just
No,
snap.
right.
And this part is really upsetting. He would then rape her with a hairspray bottle that he left inside. So the other victim, well, there's several victims, but the other victim who passed away that night was 21-year-old Margaret Bowman, and she was found dead in her bed. Her skull was essentially shattered, and she had been choked with a stocking that was so tight, her neck was almost broken.
Mm.
So, like I said, we do have a few survivors, Karen Ann Chandler and Kathy Kleiner. But, I mean, they were beaten horrifically. Kathy's jaw was broken. He beat her so badly that he knocked out multiple teeth. And Karen didn't fare much better. She too had a broken jaw, several fractures to her skull. One of her fingers was completely crushed. Like, the injury
God,
list was so extensive. And especially for these women to live is just so crazy.
years of recovery physically. That doesn't include the mental recovery.
I can't even imagine. How do you even start trying to recover from this?
Good question.
One of the most wild things about this attack, it took less than like 20 minutes. He managed to do all of that in less time than it takes me to watch a TV show. Like,
It was blind rage.
yes, I think he had just completely lost it at this point, but he wasn't done yet. He broke into another apartment, and this was about a block away, and he attacked another Florida State University student, Cheryl Thomas. By the grace of God, Cheryl did survive, but barely. And this is so sad. She was a dancer, like a classically
Hmm.
trained dancer. This is what she was going to do. She was going to be a professional dancer. And because of her injuries from this fucking asshole, she was no longer able to dance. Like, he had done so much damage. She had some hearing loss and something got messed up with like her equilibrium.
He didn't care. Any empathy he showed toward these people was only to get them to trust him so that he could exact his will. You know, he didn't care about people's hopes and dreams and plans for the
No,
future and what they wanted to be. He didn't give a shit.
no, he didn't. I will say, Edna would write in her book that when you were talking to Ted, he made you feel like the most important person in the room. Like,
Hmm.
he made you feel like he was so interested in what you were saying and he hung on your words. And it's just so strange that he was essentially two different people.
I don't know if he was though, because I think that game he would play with the victims, that was just his way of that was his personality. He would pretend to care and pretend to be
Yeah,
interested, but he didn't care.
no, you're right.
Hmm.
Well, after all these attacks, somehow he still didn't get caught. And he was staying at a boarding house at this time, and he returned there after the attacks and the murders, and that was that. So on February 9th, Ted Bundy would finally commit his last murder. And this one is really rough. His final victim, who he kidnapped and then murdered, was 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. 12.
That's another 12-year-old.
Yep. And her body wouldn't be found until April, a couple months later. And I believe her body was found in like a pigsty or a pig pen.
God. I don't know why he's picking on these kids. Like you said, it got progressively younger as his killing career went on.
Yeah, it's so weird. I don't understand what that was about.
Hmm.
So, a few days later, on February 15th, it's the middle of the night, and an officer with the Pensacola Police Department notices a car that's just kind of being suspicious. And I think the officer maybe thought that the driver was drunk. So, he runs the license plate, and it comes back as a stolen vehicle. And this officer pulls Ted over, and after a little bit of a struggle, Ted was arrested. So for
Nice.
a few days, he either refused to talk or he was giving police like fake names and saying he was a Florida State University student and his name was Chris and just making all this stuff up. But within a few days, they realized who he was. And I can only imagine the police were like, holy shit, this is Ted Mother effing Bundy in our jail. How did this
Right?
happen? In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through each and every trial because there were several in all the different states. Although, remember earlier how I mentioned the woman, Carol, that Ted met while working at the Washington Emergency Services?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Well, at this point, she was pretty much the only one still on Ted's side and believing his innocence. And so, in the middle of court one day, as this man is being tried for murder, he proposes to Carol and she accepts.
Carol, do you want to marry me?
Yes.
And I want to marry you.
Yes.
And I do want to marry you.
He said you did.
And due to some asinine loophole, they were like officially married. Because it was like he
This
did
guy
it
was
in a
smooth.
courthouse. Like, it's so ridiculous.
He's smooth.
So Ted is actually offered a plea deal at one point, and he's told that if he admits that he murdered Margaret Bowman, Lisa Levy, and Kimberly Leach, that's one of the 12-year-olds, he would be able to avoid the death penalty. But you know this man is not going to admit to shit.
Oh, hell no. That was like not his style. He probably had like 10 plans already concocted in his head about how he was going to beat the system.
I'm sure. He's just so smart, and like that's kind of a downfall. So ends up being sentenced to death for several of the murders. And before I get to the more sympathetic remarks by the judge, and his name was Judge Edward Cowart, and I do want to let you know that this judge was actually the one who referred to Ted's crimes as, quote, extremely wicked, shockingly evil and vile, end quote. And that would,
Understatement.
well, yeah, but that would later be the title of the Ted Bundy movie that came out, I think, in 2019, starring the amazingly gorgeous and perfect Zac Efron.
Please. Can Zac Efron change his own oil, cook dinner for the family, do yard work?
He has people to do that, so no.
Well, I think he's gay.
I think he's perfection, and I would watch that man watch paint dry. So
He's pretty gorgeous.
he really is. But back to
Yeah.
the judge's comments, and this statement was made after Ted was sentenced to death, like for the final time. And Judge Cowart says, quote, "You're a bright young man. You'd have made a good lawyer. I'd have loved to have you practice in front of me, but you went another way, partner." End quote. I got goosebumps as I said that. I don't know why, but
I don't know either. That's weird because it wasn't that.
I don't know. When you see it in the movie, it hits weird. I don't know. It's strange.
You know, movies are fictionalized, right? They're kind of embellished.
Oh my God, no way. Yes, I know.
They are. They're not everything you see is as dramatic.
I understand that. Well, As Ted's standing in court after being sentenced, this judge again goes to make a comment to him, and he says, quote, "Take care of yourself, young man." Ted says, "Thank you." And the judge continues with, "I say that to you sincerely. Take care of yourself. It's a tragedy for this court to see such a total waste, I think, of humanity that I've experienced in this court. I don't have any animosity to you. I want you to know that." End quote.
Why is he letting him off the hook? It's almost like this judge is forgetting all about the 36 victims and the things he did to 12-year-olds and all this other stuff, and he's like, "Well, you would have been a good lawyer, sorry. It sucks."
I just feel like this judge was too easy on Ted.
Yeah, also, you think?
Yeah, but at the same time, I also think that this judge was, like, genuinely sad and disappointed to see what Ted could have been, like, with his charisma and his brilliance, like,
How about what the 36 other people could have been? Fuck Ted Bundy, you know?
I don't know, it's like, his comments are very strange, but over the next several years, Ted would appeal, his lawyers would find silly little things to get his execution pushed back, but was finally set for January 24th, 1989. Oh, and by the way, Carol Ann gave birth to Ted Bundy's daughter in 1982.
Hmm,
Even though he wasn't supposed to have conjugal visits, but apparently the guards would sometimes look the other way so Carol and Ted could get busy. But it's so crazy that he has a daughter, and I'm not
yeah,
gonna
it
say
is.
anything else about her because I feel so badly for her, but I would
Yes.
love to ask Edna if they have any communication.
Why don't you ask her?
Maybe I will. So,
You can.
in in the last few days leading up to Ted's date with old Sparky, he decided to start talking, and I think he was almost trying to do, like, "If I keep telling you things, maybe you won't kill me."
I Yeah, I think we're past that.
Oh, absolutely. So, he confessed to several of the murders, he confessed where a lot of the bodies were disposed of, and he was definitely trying to save his own ass, but it didn't work.
Mhm, mm.
I'm pretty sure that Ted declined his last meal and just had a cup of coffee, and his final words were, quote, "Give my love to my family and friends," end quote. But by this time, I don't think his family and friends wanted that love. I mean, they're like, "No, thank you. You can
Yeah,
keep
we're
it."
good. We're good
Yeah.
on love, thanks. Mm.
And, like, they all knew he was guilty at this point. However, I do believe Louise, his mother, really struggled with this for a long time, and as a parent, how could you not? Like,
It's true.
I think deep down she knew he was guilty, but she still loved him, and she actually spoke to Ted twice on the day of his execution, which she did not attend, none of his family did. Her final words to her little Teddy were, quote, "You'll always be my precious son," end quote. And Louise
Yeah.
passed away in 2012.
That's a pretty poignant quote because you remember this sweet, tiny little child who could do no
Mhm.
wrong, and the worst thing they did was take candy when they weren't supposed to, or something dumb. And when they go on to murder all of these people, dozens and dozens of people, I don't know how you probably can't move on if you think that if that's your lasting impression of your baby boy. So it's sad.
It's just so heartbreaking. And just one last thing real quick. I will say at his execution, people treated it like a tailgating party. Like there were all these people outside partying and burn Bundy burn and like
Hmm.
all this stuff. I will say though, I, he deserved to die 100%. But so I do think it's a shame that we put him to death only to because we didn't get to learn more, but he definitely deserved it.
Oh, well, you and the judge can get together and have lunch and talk about how great Ted Bundy is.
Oh my god, that's
So,
not what I'm saying. I just mean I think that he would have valuable insights. I read somewhere that he actually helped with the Green River Killer because he kind of understood Gary Ridgway and he's like,
mhm.
"I can help you," which I'm sure he could have. So I don't know, but That is the wild story of Theodore Bundy.
That's the big one. That's the one that started it all, I think. And I'm glad that for people who don't know that story, I don't know anyone that doesn't know the story of Ted Bundy, but I mean, the details are still fascinating to hear and to you kind of forget about all the victims over the years. And I'm glad you brought. It's impossible. We'd be on for 4 hours if we covered every victim, but
I
they all
wish I could have, yeah.
I know. They all deserve recognition, but this story is about Ted and his journey into psychosis and
Mhm.
leading into our interview with Edna next week, which I think is going to really shed some light and maybe change some opinions on how you feel about nature versus nurture and how Ted's personality was different in front of his family versus how he was on the streets. So we'll
Mhm.
get to some really cool insight to bring you guys next week.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. I think it's going to be a great interview. And, if anyone has any comments about this, like, where do you think Ted went wrong? What do you think caused him to snap? We would love to hear your thoughts on that. You can hit us up on our socials, Facebook, Insta, TikTok at Murder Unscripted. You can email us with your thoughts, murderunscriptedpod@gmail.com. You can drop us a line on our website. Please, please subscribe, tell people about Murder Unscripted. We would be forever grateful.
You would.
And if this episode has taught you nothing else, just always remember that perverts don't wear signs that say they're perverts.
This was the guy who literally invented the pervert sign. That's
Mhm.
why these were made.
His would be like gold,
Yes, the VIP
a
sign.
golden pervert sign. Bye. So, Bundy sees 18-year-old Carol DeRoche. I don't know why I got.
It's pretty easy to say.
Oh my god! Oh my god!
DeRoche? DeRoche?
So people knew her because they all loved to ski out there. Ted was a big skier, actually. My nose itches. The Pacific Northwest.
The Pacific Ocean.
Yes, that one too.
The one I'm talking about.
The Pacific Ocean. In Edna's book, she talks about how Ed idolized her father, and
Who's Ed?
Ted. What did I say? Edna.
Well, you said Ed idolized. I corrected a couple, but you wrote Ed and you meant Ted.
Oh, that's weird.
Because there's Edna, Ted, and Ed.
Yeah. Oh my god. Donna was going through some mental health struggles. She did seem ready to try and make steps towards pulling herself out of this depression.
Why are you wearing headphones?
Oh, thank you. I got them for Christmas. So on July 14th, 1974, it was a super hot day in Washington, and Ted decided to spend the day at Lake... Oh, shit. I gotta listen to this. Sammamish. Okay. On July 14th, 1974, it was a super hot day in Washington, and Ted decided to spend the day at Lake Sammamish. I hope I'm saying that correctly.
Sandwich.
Damn it, Jeff.
I said spend my time.
Sammamish. Sammamish. Yeah, that's how it is. God. Okay, for the 50th time.
She pins her, stuffs the sofa in there, and abducts her. And that was absolutely inspired by Ted Bundy.
Yes, it was. And while we're on this subject, Melissa Tipp, don't be a good person. Do not help people. It is dangerous.
That's not a good tip. Don't listen to Melissa. Help people, but don't. If someone has a cast, if they have a cast, you're on your own. I'm sorry.
Just pretend you don't hear them and keep walking. Our next, that's what I do. I'm not helping someone and getting shoved into their van. If you want to shove me into a van, you at least have to be like, there's puppies, come look. I'll be there in a hot
There's
second.
candy. Yeah, you're like, come on.
Oh, I'd be there. Yeah, candy and puppies. I'm all over that.